I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm your host for this podcast, and for this episode, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. NAHIR I, OTAñO GRACIA, a special advisor to the Vice President and Associate Professor of English at the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. Her book, The Other Faces of Arthur, Chivalric Whiteness in the Global North Atlantic, which came out last year with University of Pennsylvania Press, reveals the role of Arthuriana in the racial logics of medieval Europe through an analysis of the construction of chivalric whiteness. Also, NAHIR has published widely on aspects of teaching the Middle Ages and medieval Arthuriana, and her research focuses on a very large gamut of things. So, NAHIR, it is my great pleasure to introduce you. And before I ask you to explain your research to my audience, I just want to say that your book is phenomenal. I have enjoyed it. I've been reading through it, and so I have lots of questions. But first, I'd like to give you the opportunity to explain to our audience about your research.
Thank you, Larissa, for such a lovely introduction and for saying nice things about my book. Is very exciting to have it out in the world. It took me a long time to get it published, about a decade. And so for me, it's a really big deal that I was able to do so, and that I was able to do it with such an amazing press as Penn Press. So thank you so much. So my research, there's a few things that I like to do. So my main research is looking at Arthurian literature in a gamut of different languages. So I care deeply about understanding how different cultures reshape the materials for their own ideologies. And so I really like rewritings and how, how do we remake fairy tales?
Right.
How many versions of Pride and Prejudice can I find online? I love all of that. And so my research looks at how Arthurian literature is reshaped and changed in different languages. So looking at Old Norse Icelandic, looking at Middle Welsh, looking at Castilian, Catalan, and other languages that are slightly better known, so French, Latin, English. So, but I personally want to work on the things that people don't often talk about.
Which is important because in terms of Arthurian literature, what a lot of people don't understand is that while King Arthur is this, quote, iconic figure, he has had multiple iterations for centuries. And I mean, even that first origin of, well, where does Arthur come from? Okay, we can address the possibility of whether he's a real person or not. But we can talk about that. But the point is that from the very first references to him, he kind of captured imaginations of so many different people. And he is one of those malleable figures that can serve multiple purposes in multiple contexts. So how does that specifically fit into your work on King Arthur?
That's a great question. So because he fits so well and it's a character that is changed so easily, right? And because I think very quickly there are different iterations of the character, it means that people use the materials in ways that fit and benefited them. So what I'm really interested in is understanding how Arthurian literature helps to construct what I call chivalric whiteness, which is how is it that these sort of medieval nations or empires, empires might be a better word than nations, how do these medieval empires use Arthur to show how they are the best at whatever it is they're doing, right? So chivalric whiteness is the idea that the knight is the best knight, that the knight is able to travel and go to other areas and honestly enact violence against its enemies because he is a knight, because he's chivalrous, and that gives him permission to act violently and to do so as still being the good guy, the good character, the person we root for.
The white hat, as it were, which of course in this case transfers into the fact that audiences automatically assume because there's no need to state it, that these are white European figures, correct?
Exactly. Yes. And that's a really great way to frame it, right? So you can wear this knight hat, right? This armor that protects you and that allows you to enact violence and expand the borders of these empires, right? And for me, what this allows a lot of these different places to do is to actually convince a lot of people that it's okay to go on crusade. It's okay to get on a boat someplace else and try to take those territories because you are the knight. You are like Arthur, like his knights. You are the good guy. You are doing something right.
And
And
so it
so,
pushes a colonial mindset, even in a period when most people would not actually consider that a quote colonial period. But as we know, colonialism as an ideology has existed far before Columbus ever got in a fucking boat and showed up. And I have many things to say about Isabel and Ferdinand and their endeavors with Columbus, but also the Spanish Inquisition. But all of those things are wrapped up together because, again, our modern misconception is often that the Middle Ages is a pre-colonial, but it's not. And it's that part of how you envision these Arthurian texts as part of a colonial mindset as the stories themselves get transferred to other countries as a part of dominion to an extent.
yes, I would say the way that I like to talk about it is there are tactics that really work. There are things, people, there are things that move us, that convince us to do things. And so the tactics that often we use in colonization, something like creating texts like Arthuriana that convince you that it's a good thing to go out there and defend yourself from these enemies even though you're going to their lands and you are the ones taking over, right? These tactics, they work, and so they keep coming back. We keep using them because for the people in positions of power that are interested in expanding the borders, these are the ways that you convince people to do it. So I think that's part of the reason that they sort of come back in different ways. And what I'm really interested in exploring is sort of the ways that the texts, really want to, well, really sort of hide this sort of insidiousness that is coming out. They really hide the violence and they convince you that there's actually not violence happening in this text. And so I see it myself as part of my job is to sort of show that, sort of explain why this is violent. Why is that a knight going on an adventure, going someplace else, finding a castle and saying, I found a monster, so I killed it, might actually be something really violent.
Right. And of course, in dealing with the question of monstrosity, whether we're dealing with cultural monstrosity, whether we're dealing with aspects of monster studies, when these knights go and confront giants who are
Mm-hmm.
often cast as racialized entities, as others outside. Tina Boyer has written on this. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has written on this. All of the aspects of, well, what does it mean to be a monster? Asa Simon Mittman has written on it. In some ways, that opposition of us versus them
Mm-hmm.
is that automatic sense of us good, them bad. And you see this in a lot of ways as a reflection of that colonial idea. And it's just not presented. I mean, of course, they're not going to present themselves in a bad way. They're not going to say, "Well, we're shitheads for doing this." They're not going to do that. They're going to say, "We have to do this," and that translates in many ways, especially because the idea and culture of knighthood is one that's promoted really starting in about the 11th and 12th century in the crusading period.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is something that do you think the authors want others to aspire to?
Well, I think so, yes. I think these stories are doing a lot of things. Part of it is wanting to excite people and convince them to go on these adventures and go on crusade, right? But I think it's also helping people that come back that are coming back probably, maybe with shell shocked and PTSD, feeling, I hurt people. I saw these horrible things that are coming back, and it's also a way to help them deal with that, right? So
Interesting.
then they have multiple purposes because they convince you to go, but then they convince you that you didn't do anything wrong. And so that you are the good person, that what you did was right, even though it doesn't feel right. And so I
That's a
think that they're actually doing a lot of work. And I think if you often even look still now, the moments where wars become more present in our society, or we become more center space, we tend to get more films about war, right? And more films about our Arthurian literature, or more fantasies about going and having a group of a motley crew that's going to save the day, right? All these things, superheroes, they are doing some of that work for us here of helping us deal with the trauma of all of these
well, and you,
violence.
yeah, I was just saying, and as somebody who works a lot on violence, which I do, it's an interesting idea because I haven't actually thought of it that way, that the literature gives an outlet for PTSD as a means of justifying the action. So you don't feel so bad. What you did was justifiable. I mean, I know about the atrocities, and of course, when we talk about the Crusades, especially the Third Crusade and the massacre at Acre, and I discussed that with Richard Abels, the accounts of it in real time are horrific. And there are people who were like, this is horrific. And then there are people who are like, yeah, well, it was necessary. I mean, Richard the First, that's what he says. He says, yeah, well, we had to do it. And so the literary texts, in trying to justify, and there are some literary texts that I would argue are being more critical, but it's possible that they're not. There are multiple ways to interpret this, but I haven't really thought about it, and possibly because I am a white middle-aged woman, I haven't thought about it as encoding whiteness. And yet, of course, it does. Of course it does. Because there's no discussion of the ethnicity or the skin color of any of these characters unless they're being put forward as the enemy, as the monster who's got to be fought, or the somehow the aberration in society. Otherwise, there's no discussion of anybody's skin color. Can you expand a bit more on how race would have been envisioned in the Middle Ages? One of these days, I've got to ask Geraldine Heng if she's willing. I know she's busy, but her book on the invention of race in the Middle Ages is really important, really, really, because the way modern people think about race is not necessarily how medieval people thought about race.
Yes. Yes. First, I think it's always important to sing the praises of Geraldine Hang and to tell everybody that they should read everything she's put out. She's magnificent. She is a model of not just what it is to do good writing and to do deep, difficult thinking about the Middle Ages, but also a model of how to be a considerate scholar and a generous scholar. So
Yeah.
I
Her
think,
work is amazing. Empire of Magic is one of the first books I had in looking at the question of torture and brutality as a facet of national identity in the Middle Ages. So her work is phenomenal.
yes. And Empire of Magic, of course, was the first book that really guided me. I think Medieval Boundaries, also by Chiara Kinoshita, was really important.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, Geraldine Heng's Empire of Magic was key. And in it, she says in her introduction, she has like a little section where she mentions race. And I think she says something that race is like a fiction, right? Race is a fantasy with material consequences.
Right.
And I thought that was one that I think that when I think about critical thinking, that's what I think about. I think that when we're doing critical thinking, we want to understand the consequences, right? And when we're looking at literature, what are the consequences of the ideologies that these texts are throwing at us, right? And I think when I look at Arthurian literature as a whole, right, they really want to convince us that the knight is is normal, right? They're
It's the ideal.
normalizing. Yes,
Yeah.
the knight is normal. He's the ideal, but he's also normal. He is what you see. There's a wonderful text. One of my favorite texts is Chrétien de Troyes, The Night of the Lion.
Yes.
And it's such a fun story. I love that story. It's also really, the racial implications of the text are really open, even though people sort of don't realize it. So there's a character called the Man in the Woods, and he is described, I believe, 3 times in the text. So the first, Yvain's cousin describes him, describes his adventure, and describes the character. And then Yvain imagines himself going through the same adventure because Yvain wants to avenge his cousin because he got knocked out of his horse by a black knight. Yeah, and the day went gray. It was a dark day when he got knocked out, right? So all those implications that we already start to hear, right? So we meet this character. He's described as dark as a ferron, or like a black cauldron. He's
Right.
described as a Moor, right? Which is a word used very much for Muslims, right? So he's described as a creature. He's described in all these negative ways. But the character, this Man in the Woods, when they ask him, when Calgrenan, the cousin of Yvain, asks him, what kind of character are you? Like, what kind of creature are you? He says, I am a man, as you see before you. So he defends his humanity, right? But Calgrenan doesn't believe him. Then Yvain calls him a creature again. So even though we have this scene that tells us, no, no, I am a man, the text as a whole discards him that way. And when this character, the Man in the Woods, asks Calgrenan, who is he, right? Because he just got asked. He's like, I am a knight, as you see before you, right? So Calgrenan gets to be a knight, as you see. He's just what you see, but this man doesn't get the same. It doesn't get afforded the same things, right? And so here, for me, is when you understand how whiteness is being played here, because whiteness becomes a race that is marked as having an absence of racialization, right? So you just get to be who you are. You
Right.
don't get to be something else, right? And then these characters in the Middle Ages are racialized in very different ways. But I think what's important that the texts are doing is that they are racialized because they are not the norm. They are not normal, right? So they can be giants, they can be Muslims, they can be in other parts of the text, we have little people. So there are all kinds of ways that the text mark them as not normal. They are
Right.
not what you see before.
And then
It's
if
not what
they,
you see.
right, and then if they behave in a way that is similar or chivalric, then it's, oh my gosh, this other entity is capable of behaving the same way as chivalry. And I will point out to my viewers that the definition of white privilege is not about wealth. It's not about background. It is simply the fact that if you have white skin, you don't have to think about that when you walk out the door. I feel the need to say this to my audience because I know what y'all are thinking, but really, white privilege is simply the fact that we don't have to think about it. It's not our day-to-day existence where it's like we have to behave differently when we walk out the door because we're white. And this is part of what's in the Arthurian texts because these knights just get to make assumptions about everybody else because as far as they're concerned, they're the norm. They're the status quo. And I think in Arthurian, what's so interesting, any of the Arthurian texts, that you have references to the Black Knight, the Blue Knight, the Green Knight. In some cases, that's armor, but in some cases, it's not. Can you expand on that a bit? Because I get them all confused at some point because I'm like, are we talking about what? People think Monty Python and the Holy Grail and the Black Knight because his armor is black, but that's not always what it means.
Is not always what it means, and it's not always clear. Actually, one of my favorite things in working with medieval literature and medieval languages is how much there's a play with the language, so that things can be more than one thing simultaneously.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And this happens actually in a lot of medieval languages. There's a play of words that is just so rich and textured, and it becomes very hard to actually kind of translate because it's hard, you got to pick a word and you might have three. And so it becomes important to understand that there are multiple instances where there's a play with words and things can mean more than one thing. And so it could be black armor, but it doesn't have to be black armor. And that's something that I spent considerable time showing in my work, is how language actually helps us understand when it's more complicated than just one way of understanding, that we have to hold multiple ideas at the same time. This knight might be a black knight because he's having armor, but he might be a black knight because his skin is black. And we are not meant to know that answer. We're not meant to know. We're meant to hold these two truths together at the same time. And we can see this more clearly in lesser known texts. So Chrétien's in Vain is a pretty well established Arthurian text. But we also have texts, for example, in Old Norse Icelandic, where we have characters that are not as well known. So my example is in this 14th century Arthurian text. It's a Tristan text in Old Norse Icelandic, and in this version of the text, we get Tristan, instead of being in Brittany, right? So instead of going from sort of England to Brittany, he actually goes.
Brittany's the sticky. If this is a map of France, Brittany's the sticky out bit for people who don't know. This is the best way to describe France. That's Brittany. It's the sticky out bit of France. But yes, the Icelandic Riðarar saga, and I'll let you explain that in a minute. But the Icelandic Riðarar saga are fascinating because the milieu in which they are written, and I have a section on them in Torture and Brutality about national identity and how the Icelandic texts resist Norwegian control, which you say the same thing. And I was like, yay, because a lot of people don't see it that way, but it is absolutely a resistance against Norwegian control. And I say it in terms of the presence of torture and brutality in some of these texts, and how the Icelanders are like, fuck you, we were an autonomous collective, thank you Monty Python, we were a commonwealth, and because our society tore itself apart, we had to give ourselves over to Norwegian rule. But in the adaptation even of the Riðarar saga, that is the saga of guys on horses. Chevalier, chivalry, same thing, guys on horses. It's the Riders saga. They interpret the texts as they came from the continent. They came into Norway, and then the Icelanders went, we like them, but we're going to change them to suit ourselves. And most of the Norse texts that we have in any respect survive in Iceland only, because the Icelanders wrote everything down and saved it. Possibly less likely to burn shit from other people. But what you end up with is a very distinctly Icelandic interpretation of chivalry that resists Norwegian colonial control, which itself is a response to the desire to, as you say very correctly, to be part of this European identity. Like, no, we may be back here, we may have this Viking history, but no, really, we're just as chivalric as you people. So in that Icelandic version of Tristan og Isolde, it's the Tristan og Isolde, explain specifically how you did this, because I like I said, I read your book. I was like, yeah, sorry, I love it. It's amazing. I think everybody who's interested in Arthurian should get a copy of The Other Face of Arthur. Period. Other Faces of Arthur is fantastic. Now, back to Tristan og Isolde.
Thank you for doing that, because I was like, oh, which one's the name of that one? I have, yes, too many primary texts, so sometimes
that's
the
okay.
titles escape me.
It's okay.
So I'm glad I have you to do that for me. So in the story, which is, again, I highly recommend people read it. It's such a fun story. So Tristan is Tristan's father is not from is from Spain, right? So now you have a story that is not set in Brittany and in Britain, but it's actually set in Britain and Spain. And so, yes.
And of course, for most people don't realize that in this period, when we're talking about 12th, 13th, 14th century Europe, the Iberian Peninsula was largely under Muslim control. Most people do not realize that.
Yes, and by the 14th century, the control of the peninsula has shifted considerably, right? But it is understood as a space of crusading, right? And so Tristan is from Spain, and he when he goes when he leaves Britain and goes to Spain and meets the second Isolde, right? So we have the Isolde, the titular character, then a second Isolde, often called Isolde of the White Hands. And in this version, she is Isolde, Black Isolde from Spain, right? So they changed her name from Isolde of the White Hands to Black Isolde. And the word used is Varta here, right? And so often it gets translated to Isolde Dark. But actually, if you look at the word and the etymology of the word, it means black. It does not mean
Yeah.
dark, right? So she gets so the translations purposely sort of soften the racial implications of having this character be Isolde the Black from Spain, right? The idea that because she's from Spain, she is darker skinned. So that's very much there. What's also really interesting is that there's also a pirate in the story who is his name is Blackamanaveller, which I'm sure you can pronounce more beautifully than me.
The
Um,
Novella. Yeah, well, and of course, Viking texts, we like our pirates because they would relate to this
mhm.
on so many levels. But I actually just, when you talk about the Isolde the Black from Spain, again, this is a modern misconception that many people have about even the variations of skin color with which most people would be familiar. A lot of people wanted to argue, I mean, early Shakespeare scholarship, racist as fuck. Let me just say, God damn, that stuff is racist. Where they're like, no, Shakespeare would never have seen a dark person when he's talking about Othello and da da da. It's like, yeah, absolutely, he would have. The assumption that somehow your white European population would never have encountered people who were not white is complete nonsense, because of course they did. And the fact that the translations often try to make her just darker rather than black is an important part of the translations. And translations often say more about the translator than they do about the original text.
They do. And what's also interesting is that the second character is also described as black, but he comes from Africa, right? And we get a different word for black here than we do for her, right? So distinguishing them, not just in that they're black, but they're different types of they inhabit different types of blackness, right? And so that is what I find really interesting of these texts is that it shows I don't want to say necessarily specific, but like a really deep understanding of race and that people are different and that we have multiple skin colors run in multiple ways and a deep understanding of this.
It's a
Um,
sophisticated interpretation that
Very
recognizes
sophisticated.
geography as much as it does skin color. Because
Yeah.
even the term Moor, which is not a term that we should use anymore, but it actually comes from the area of North Africa that's Mauritius that goes back to early days of even pre-Christian. I've just been doing research on this for another project. And the idea of the Moors as North African specifically was geographical as much as skin tone. And when you have a very large Christian population in the first 2 centuries who are Moors, that becomes problematic later when you're talking about the migration of people into Iberian Spain. So the terms have then take on a derogatory one. And when by the time we got in the Middle Ages, Saracen, not a thing. Saracens are a not an actual identity except for something in text as a, well, we think we're these people who might have some Muslim things, but we're going to also have them worship Apollo because it's a stock character. It's not an accurate representation. But then you have texts like the Icelandic one that says, we have somebody from Spain who is black in this way and somebody from Africa who's black in this way. And
Yes.
it depends on the context, but there were people who were very sophisticated in their thinking about geography as much as skin color.
Yes. And all of these things are connected, right? Because it's um it's all very complicated, right? None of these things these are all constructions. And so part of what's really wonderful about working with Arthurian literature is because we have so many versions. And because we have hundreds of years between them, we can also see some of these changes on how whiteness and race gets sort of codified in the text, right? And so this later Tristan version has right these different sophisticated ideas about blackness, but you also get the earlier version of Tristan, which takes two scenes, the giant scenes from the Historia Regum Britanniae, which is 12th century, and it rewrites them. And it rewrites them specifically for an Icelandic audience. But what I do want to say is one very specific change in that text. While the giants there's these giants, right? And in the Historia, they're from Hispaniarum, right? So they're from the many Spains. But in this Icelandic Tristan story, right, which is about 100 years later, they're from Africa. And this change becomes really important because when the Historia was written, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. And so the giants are from Spain.
Right.
But by the second version, 100 years later, Spain, what we know now as Spain, right? The Castilians, the Catalans, all these different kingdoms that were living in the north of Spain have slowly conquered the peninsula and moved slowly downwards to conquering the peninsula. And so suddenly now these giants are from Africa. And this saga was written around the same time where actually the Catalans, and the Castilians were partitioning the north of Spain for themselves. They were creating documents saying how they would divide the north of Spain when they conquered it, right? So you have the text creating a narrative that we have to go to Africa to fight these giants. And you have these actual countries creating documents saying this is how we're going to divide it when we conquer it.
Right. Well, and I mean, you do see this in so many textual traditions that are trying to create a sense of national identity. And this is one of the things that I've been working on for a bazillion years, where, of course, a lot of modern people go, oh, there's no nations as we think. Yes, 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 yes. National identity was based on language, culture, and a shared set of ideally values that might be grounded in religion or cultural traditions or law. So fuck yes, medieval people had senses of national identity all the time, constantly. And literature reinforces it. Literature is the way that you encode it. Literature is the way that you say, you see, we have this as a shared history. And we even get this in the inception of Arthur in Geoffrey of Monmouth, because that whole invention of Arthur by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who says, I found an ancient text in the British tongue, Welsh. I mean, he, as a Welshman on the border in Pembrokeshire, in Wales, writing in Oxford with his own contested identity of a Norman father, but a Welsh background. And you've got a bunch of Norman invaders fighting a civil war over their land. And he's going, hang on a second, we've got our own history before you lot showed up. And guess what? This one's going to come back. He's our once and future king. Arthur is at the very origin of his story, meant to be an assertion of a national identity. And so it's not surprising that he can be adapted for every literary tradition that is trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, and he is adapted, right? He becomes a character that can mean lots of different things for different people. And he does mean different things. And that's part of what I really try to do in my book, is to show how they all use him differently, how they are constructing whiteness differently, how they are constructing race differently, right? Because none of these things are fixed. They're not the same. The way that race and whiteness are understood in Albuquerque, where I am from, is not the same as they would be understood where Larissa, where you're from, where you're.
I live outside of Baltimore. Yeah,
Oh, there you go. They're not.
It's very different in the way that it's constructed. And of course, every part of American society, every part of Western European society has its own views of this, which of course has made our field kind of contentious, and rightly so, because it's about time we fucking dealt with it. And we're still not dealing, some people are still not dealing with it. But all of this is very important for even thinking about why we study what we study. Yes?
I think so.
I mean, it is because if we even think about the way that people decided, well, this is Europe, this is going to be the canon of medieval literature. This is the
Yeah.
literature that we've got to do. And it's going to be predominantly English. It's going to be predominantly in English. It's, or, or English translations and variations, because that's where we get our study of medieval studies. Despite the fact that there's like five different options for languages on the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, it's not just Spanish, it's Catalan, it's Aragonese, it's Castilian. You've got a whole bunch of options. Same thing in France. France is not a unified political entity until at least the 13th century, really. And you've got Occitan, you've got the Norman French, you've got Provençal, you've got all different kinds of variations. English is probably the only one that was English. That,
And we do get different Middle English,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah, we
we
do.
call them all Middle English, but it's not the same to read Chaucer as it is to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, right?
Right.
Because the Middle English that they're written in is very different. I can give my students Chaucer, and even though it's hard for them, they can get it. I can give them some Middle English romances and they can get it, but they can't do that with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And yet we call it both Middle English.
Right.
So very it is very important to see that the ways that we understand Europe now are very much not what Europe was in the Middle Ages, but also that in some ways it is. Like there are things that continue to stay and that we can see that we continue to do and work with, right? Because at the end of the day, they were humans like we're
Right.
humans. So I think that's part of the excitement, is to read something that in some ways it feels familiar and in other ways it's so different than who we are. And so that's part, I think, of what makes medieval literature so exciting to read and so fun to read is the ways that it doesn't quite fit with what we expect. And I certainly love that about it. But like I show in my work, I'm also somebody who pays attention to the ways that the literatures we have available are also being used as sort of forms of propaganda, and what kinds of what is it that they want us, what do they want to convince us of, right? What
Right.
is it that these stories want us to think is normal? And then how can we, as critical thinkers, understand what the implications of that?
Well, and if you think about even the question of translation, because I mean you were 100% right, and I was thinking about it even as you were talking about the process of translation, is that I when I teach Chaucer, when I Geoffrey Chaucer, I have to use Middle English with glosses, because if you translate Chaucer, you're going to miss all the double entendres. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
miss the possibilities for interpretation. Chaucer knew his shit. He knew what he was talking about. He actually traveled extensively, which again dispels that modern misconception that medieval people didn't go anywhere. He was in southern France. He was in northern Italy. That's how he comes into contact with Boccaccio. He understood as a soldier a variety of different terminologies and languages. I wrote a piece not too, God, I guess it was like 10 years now. Huh. Okay. It's funny how time just flies, but it was on soldiers and surgeons and Chaucer's use of medical language. He uses very specific terminology for addressing medical knowledge, which suggests that he was aware of it, which either he read it himself or because as a soldier he came into contact with some of it. We often underestimate the breadth of experience that medieval people had and their exposure to different people, ideas, trade, all of that. And it's wrong to do it. But in translating texts, we make choices. Every translator makes choices. And Sir Gawain the Green Knight, you're right. We got to translate that shit because my students are like, what?
Yeah, it's not accessible necessarily. You
No.
have to work very hard. But
Ugh.
yeah, so that's part of it, right? We're working, and for me, as somebody who's so interested in language and the ways that language work in the Middle Ages and how these different languages are working. And I have to say, in my book, I think I work with I want to say like 9 different languages.
Yeah.
It's a lot
Yeah.
of them. um, I have to rely on translations to help me because my audience can't access all of these languages, right?
Right.
And so I need to rely on translations a lot, and I have to trust my colleagues that they're doing translations in good faith, right? Just like I want people to know that when I translate, because I do have to translate in the book, that I'm doing the best I can and that I'm writing them in good faith. And so, in that sense, when you're doing research, I feel like, Chaucer was a spy. We're pretty sure he went to Spain,
Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I feel like maybe, being a medievalist is a bit like being a spy. You gotta put all these pieces together. So we're just following Chaucer in that way.
I love that because everything comes back to Chaucer. Now, as I've said before, when I taught an American, I had a student who was in my Chaucer class who I could swear she told me she was from Brooklyn, but a friend of mine from Brooklyn said that sounds more Long Island. Oh my God, she loved Chaucer, the student. She sat in the front row of my Chaucer class. Fucking Chaucer. Chaucer's awesome. All semester. Oh my God, I love Chaucer. And it sticks in your head. It really does. But everything does come back to Chaucer because in so many ways, he's kind of the embodiment of what it meant to be a widely traveled, widely read person in the 14th century. Now, we know of him because he wrote stuff down, but that's not what he was famous for in his own lifetime. As you say, he was a spy, he was a statesman, he was a tax collector, he did all kinds of shady shit, and we'll never know fully what it was he did. But we have to kind of extract our information the same way because we're working off of texts. Texts are written in a certain context and in different languages. And one of the things that I found intriguing about your book even was the discussion about what it meant to be Europe in the Middle Ages. So can you explain a little bit about how how medieval people thought of Europe as an entity?
Ooh, that's a hard question. Let me see. Well,
Because
I
you
think that
extract it, you dismantle that idea that there's any one sense of Europe, that as we think of Europe, it's not how medieval people thought of it.
no, it wasn't. But also that I think it's important to point out that the ways that people in positions of power, which at first are the ones that commission these Arthurian texts, right? And the people, more local people, just being at home, they have different ideas about what they understood about Europe. And so these things, it's not fixed. Europe is not fixed. But there is a way in these texts, especially as we continue to move, in which the idea is that you are, part of your own group, but also when we come together, we become something bigger. And that in some ways is what becomes Europe, right? So separately, I'm Puerto Rican, right? But when I come to these sort of ideas, and I think there's some of that in the text, where in the ways that Europe was understood, where you have very local ideas about what it means to be Europe, what it means to be part of a group and belonging, and then once you bring groups together, you have a very a broader interpretation of that. And often is when you're out of that sort of local space, and then you become Europe. And it's not necessarily that they said, "Oh, we're now Europe," but that they talk about themselves as coming together. And that, so that's part of what I try to point out in the group, the ways that positionality shifts depending on who you are. And once you get to later texts in the 15th century, especially, you start to see these ideas that all of these groups are coming together, and we're going to stop, Moors and Muslims from attacking us, and we're doing it together. And so you get this idea of a group coming together in these ways to enact violence against other groups of people.
And use and justify it as a sense of defensiveness rather than a sense of offense. Sorry, I was like, wait a minute, what's the opposite of defense? Offense. Because of course, when you think about the fact the idea that the Middle Ages ends, quote unquote, in 1453 with the Ottoman Turks, taking over Constantinople, that Muslim threat that's on our borders becomes part of some of the literary texts of the 15th century. And even encoded in some of the earlier texts. I mean, you think of a text like Song of Roland. And the Song of Roland, written in the 12th century in England, the main one we've got, survives in a manuscript in Oxford. That's important. Because I actually would argue that it's fairly critical of the Franks because Charlemagne looks like an idiot by the end of it. Also, very violent for no reason and against the actual historical laws and historical documents we know of Charlemagne in terms of how he conducted himself. But the actual Battle of Roncesvalles in 778 isn't against Muslims. It's
Mhm.
not in any way an opposition of Christian versus Muslim. But the text in the 12th century situates it very clearly in those religious terms. Is that what you see as part of this discussion of race in the Arthurian text? That where it may not have actually, in any sense, have involved race or religious difference that's encoded with race in this, because you could have Muslims who were not, who were white, and in some texts the religion was the issue, not the race. Because if you converted to Christianity, you were fine. Once that happened, and in some cases, you actually go from being black to white. We have some of those texts once you convert. I know I just asked a whole bunch of questions there, but is this part of what you see in the Arthurian texts as a function of whiteness and religious identity?
Yes. So I think that's a really important part. Because race is slippery and it changes from place to place, it also means that the markers that can racialize people are different. And yes, being not being Christian was one of those huge markers, right? And another one is not being, it became later on also like you not only, it's not only that you have to be like convert to Christianity, is that you have to be the right kind of pagan to convert to Christianity, right? So it goes from conversion would fix this problem, and I'm making quotes because obviously there's no problem, but that was the logic of these texts, right?
Yeah.
And later on, that's just not enough, right? Because part of what we can see in the text through time is the ways that what racializes people can change, right? And so you see in the earlier texts less conversations about people's, about people. It was giants, right? It was monsters. You fought monsters. You fought giants. The giants were in Spain, and then the giants are in Africa, right? And these giants have families in these texts. They have cousins, they have brothers, right? One of the giants accuses Tristan of killing his cousin and killing his I think it's his father or grandfather, right? So there's ways in which these texts create these giants in ways that they have family units. Earlier stories like Colquhoun, where you see that the giant has a daughter who marries a human man, right? So they are able to marry humans, right? So we start with giants. We start with the man in the woods is also bigger than normal, but also a Moor. So we go from giants, then we have Moors. And so the language that we use, right, by the 14th century, we have Black Isolt, we have a Black African, right? We get more and more markers that are racializing characters. And these change depending on the place, depending on the time. And because we have so many Arthurian texts working throughout time, we can use those texts to look at those differences and just think through how things are changing in the context that they're coming up. And for me, I think that was the one of the most important things that I wanted to do with this book was to be able to use the Arthuriana, one to tell people how much Arthurian text there are, because I don't think that even medievalists understand how many texts. We have texts that have never been translated to English, such as La Faula, which is a Catalan text, and it is fabulous. We need to get it translated. Um, but also that these texts are all doing something slightly different. And what is it that they're doing? What does it teach us? And the best way to understand them is by putting them in conversation with each other. And I hope that that comes across in a book. In some ways, it was so much information. I think there's a lot of things happening in the
Yeah.
book. It
Well,
becomes hard to explain. But I think that to me is the most important part, trying to show that in each of these different languages, the things that the markers that racialize people and the markers that normalize people change in each of the stories.
They're not inherent. They're not automatically there in every variation. And actually that is one of the things that I loved about your book, because so many medievalists work in isolation. And we do. Not slagging medievalists, but a lot of medievalists work in one language, or they work in one context only. So you do have scholars of Catalan who would be familiar with the text, but they're not necessarily producing it in a way that's accessible to people who don't read Catalan. And you have the same thing with people who work in Italian, because again, disparate Italian city states. And so they focus on a specific area or language without looking outside of that. And for a very long time, medieval studies has not been interdisciplinary, and it should be. And that's one of the advantages of what you've done in the book, is that you say, ha ha, we're going to take this one genre of Arthurian texts and say, here are the different versions, and contextualize it in terms of understanding race, understanding identity. And that is so very important, because for that very reason, is that medieval people knew the stories. That's why they wrote them in their own language, because they knew them. They had access to them. Your average medieval person who was literate had at least two languages. They would have had their own, and they would have had Latin, and then potentially other things. It's impossible to necessarily know or overstate that case, but we know that the stories travel for a reason. And people were able to read them in one version and then adapt them to their own language. And one of the things that when you brought up the Welsh, Culhwch Owen, the fascinating thing about that is, yeah, her father Ysbyddaden is a giant, but he's not a racialized giant. He isn't supernatural, otherworldly-esque is kind of the only explanation for him, but clearly his daughter is human enough to marry Cohen. Yeah. And yet then of course you also end up with, and this is a point of contention with people, and I have to occasionally, the Green Knight is not a giant. People say that, they're like, he's a giant. No, he's not. The poet says he's half a giant, I trust. It is a hyperbole. He's just really tall. But he's a supernatural entity who is given that supernatural affect. You know, you can cut his head off and then pick it up, because of the magic of Morgan Le Fay. But this assumption of what giants are and what giants are not, and I adore Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, but in his analysis of giants, he puts a lot of characters as giants who really aren't. But it's that first important analysis of what makes something an other, and how racialized is it. Because also a lot of giants are from Genoa. That's another place where you get a lot of giants from Genoa in Italy. And again, that has associations with race as well. And people are like, yeah, but it's Northern Italy. Again, there were shades of this as you get into the early centuries in the Middle Ages. In the alliterative Mort d'Arthur, the giant of Mont Saint-Michel with his cloak of beards, the beards that he has demanded as tribute, it's woven in Spain. There's a reason for that. And so I think what you have to say is really important about how all of these things shift and change, and how many there are, because you're right, most people don't realize it.
Yeah. And yeah, so it was a lot of fun to put it together, but it was a lot of work, and I'm glad it's out in the world.
Well, and I mean, I'm delighted it's out in the world, and there's going to be, I imagine there's an awful lot of dialogue that's going to happen, because, I mean, as you said, it took 10 years to get this into print, and there was a resistance to reading Arthurian in any racialized way, because a lot of people don't want to. They don't want to acknowledge that the assumption that all the knights are white comes from a predominant narrative of whiteness being good. So can you explain a bit how our field has shifted enough where this book could come to print? Because I've experienced the same thing in terms of gender and sexuality in writing stuff, because people are like, getting my partner article, arguing that the partner is a cross-dressing woman, and having, scholars go, no, absolutely, no, I don't, you made a great case, but I don't agree with you, so fuck off. That was the process I went through for that. What how did the obstacles that you dealt with in getting this book published, how have they shifted? And do you think they've shifted enough?
Well, not enough.
I mean, the book's in print and Penn
The,
is a very good press,
yes.
but
So it took a long time. And honestly, what it took was it took it's I think it's important to explain that Penn Press right now has a series called the Race Before Race series, which is spearheaded by Ayana Thompson and Geraldine Hang. And they very much created these series for work on race in both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, right? And pre-modern race. And it took that series, it took having Geraldine Hang reading the introduction and realizing that this book would fit perfectly. It took a lot of work, honestly. It took people believing in the project for the project to get published. But before that, the project had been rejected several times by different presses. Uh, you know, one press held the book for 9 months and never sent it out to peer review. They said that they just couldn't find reviewers that could actually review the book because it was too many languages. So they told me that they wanted exclusivity, but then they didn't send it out. Another press was very interested. I got the reviews, and then one of the reviewers was very positive and asked for changes. The other reviewer was not so positive, and so they wanted to get two new reviewers, and so then the process would have gotten much more extended. And this is after I made extensive revisions based on those reviews, right? So it took having someone in a position of power who believed in the project for the project to get through, right? And if not, the process itself would have stopped the book from being out. Like, and I say this, I am very proud of the work that I've done. I think this is a really great book. I think it's a much more ambitious book than most books, right? And I don't think that it deserved the amount of resistance it received, right? I don't.
I would agree with you, but I would agree with you. And as I said, I've read it, and I it is phenomenal. And I am revising a book on England's medieval literary heroes, and I have a chapter on Arthur, and I will most assuredly be quoting you because, in terms of identifying how we think about medieval texts at all, our prejudices in medieval studies have been shaped for over a century or two about what is an appropriate way to interpret texts. And that's a problem. And like I said, with so many medievalists who work in isolation, and that's not, that's just how many people are trained. The ability to say, okay, here are a variety of languages. And I encountered that myself with Torture and Brutality, because there were people who are like, you cover too much or too many different places. I mean, I have Norse, I have French, I have Middle English, I have Old English, I have Middle Dutch in there. And, and I did not touch Spain for Torture and Brutality for a reason. I could probably do a sequel. But to recognize the interdisciplinarity of medieval literary texts is important for understanding the interdisciplinary and complexity of the Middle Ages, and that not every person thought the same way, even of this icon.
Yeah.
And I gathered that was part of your vision for this book, was that idea of really revealing more complexity in the way medieval people thought about the character, but also thought about their racial and geographic identities.
Yeah, well, and honestly, I wanted to work with these texts because they're fabulous and people weren't talking about them and we're not putting them in conversation with each other. And I just thought there was so much to do and I wanted to try to do it. So, but what I'm getting at here is that there was a way in which the field I really worked against getting this book out, right? And as now that it's out, everything I've heard have been positive, and maybe it's just because people don't want to tell me the negative, right? But everything I've heard has been very positive, and then what that tells me is that that resistance wasn't about how good the work was, and it was about something else, right? And so the resistance I experienced then demonstrates that it isn't about that we're not a meritocracy and that the best work is necessarily getting out there, but that there are also ways in which people with specific ideologies get to control who gets to publish, right? And as you were saying about your own work, I get that there is it's very important to have research that is very deep and is looking at very specific things from one perspective. And at the same time, we need research that is looking broadly, that is looking at the forest, right?
Yeah.
We need the trees, we need the forest, and they're both doing things and they complement each other. And we are better scholars when we do the work of allowing these different kinds of research to work together, as opposed to deciding that because I don't feel comfortable with this type of research, I am not going to allow it to exist, which is what I experienced. I
Yeah.
think the other part you mentioned is our training. I think that our training has been, medieval studies as a field was created in the 19th century, and it was created and people were trained very myopically to understand things one way that benefited the creation of colonization and the
Yeah.
idea that Europe was the best in the world. It is about giving medieval Europe, well, giving Europe a history,
Right.
right? Because before the 19th century, the Middle Ages were the Dark Ages, right? Petrarch said it is the Dark Ages. They don't count. It was all terrible. And suddenly you're trying to take over the rest of the world, and you're telling places like India and China that you are better than they are, except that they have these rich, long histories,
Right.
and you've been calling your history the Dark Ages. And so the Middle Ages, as a field of study, was created to say we have actually a long history and it's actually better than yours,
Yeah.
right? And that's why we created it. So to be good medievalists today is to retrain ourselves and to understand that so much of what we've been taught and what built our scholarship was white supremacist.
Yes.
And
100%. Yeah. And in recognizing that there are medieval societies, if we just talk chronologically, if we're talking about that 1,000 years, and of course the Dark Ages doesn't exist, it's not a thing. It's a complete and utter nonsense, rubbish term. Please stop using it. I say this to the wider webiverse. Stop. It doesn't exist. But to recognize the fact that in that 1,000 year period, you have Indian societies, the Mughal Empire, you have in China, even Genghis Khan, who gets a terrible rap, largely from the people that he conquered, they had such a sophisticated system of laws in the Mongol Empire that it ran smoothly for a reason. It wasn't all violence and conquest. It was, we have a legal structure in place that works. And in some respects, you have countries in Europe that don't have a legal system as sophisticated as that of Genghis Khan and his family. The fact that Ethiopia, the Ethiopian society, especially the first Christian centuries, and like I said, I'm doing research on this for another project. I'm doing a great course on. Yeah, and so I'm writing the episode drafts right now. I've got to write 24 episodes. They're half-hour episodes, so they're about 4,500 words each, but it's on medieval Christianities, plural. The same kind of idea that as much as people assume that there's a unified identity, either a unified Christian identity or a unified racial identity or some kind of unified identity, there isn't. In the Middle Ages, everything is still shifting. Everything is changing. The reason that the Catholic Church had to keep saying, no, this is our doctrine. No, this is our doctrine. Wait, no, we changed our mind. Now this is our doctrine, is because they couldn't agree. It's like they couldn't agree on the color of shite. But it's also because the Middle Ages was far more complex and in flux than modern audiences want. And you're 100% correct that the uniformity created by 19th century scholarship to support white supremacy and colonialism is part of that endeavor. So they impose it
Mhm.
on medieval texts. But as you point out in your book, quite correctly and aptly, the colonial ideology was there too. There is medieval colonialism, Norway, Iceland, even in the Iberian Peninsula, especially with the work that you did on Arthuriana. What do you think modern audiences can learn from the Middle Ages and the reality of the Middle Ages that you present in your book?
I think what I realized in this book and seeing how how much these texts work, how hard, right, these texts are working to convince people that it's okay to hurt other people, like how hard they are working to make you think that these structures of power are inevitable demonstrates that they're not, right? The reason why we need so much propaganda and so many things to convince us that it is inevitable to have these wars, that is a good thing to have these, that you can feel okay about it, is because we don't. Because um, after all of it, people have no interest in hurting each other or going out someplace else to take over other people's lands. Most people do not want this. And so what I've learned from this is that it takes a lot of work. And right now, our governments are working very hard to convince us that what is happening is inevitable, but it isn't. They are working very hard to it. And these texts are evidence that they've always had to work very hard for it, because ultimately people are not interested in hurting each other. We
And
we that is, people like to say, oh, it's universal, right? Like war is universal. We've always conquered each other. And what I want to say to that is it wasn't. It has been normalized, and it has been universalized by people constructing these ideas that this has always been the case. And it's just not, right?
and I mean, and that's one of the discussions when Elaine Scarry talks about the body in pain and the process of using torture. They had unstable states use torture. Unstable states rely on violence and brutalizing other people because they themselves are unstable. It's a reflection not of strength but of weakness. And I know in the work that I've done on torture and brutality, looking at the points where literature rejects it, because literature does sometimes reject that. Literature will often go, you know what, that's too much. We're not okay with this. And did you find moments where the violence in the Arthurian text you're talking about, where there is a shade of criticism about using that violence excessively?
I I think that you find lots of moments where that is the case. I do think that part of it is because that I think the texts are very aware that they want to bring people in, and so to bring people in, you also have to sound fair, right? And so a lot of the times, I think that the criticism that you see is less about criticizing, but about bringing you in and into the status quo, right? And expanding it. What I do think is that there's a lot of genres in the Middle Ages that have no interest in these violences, right? And that they're doing very different things. And I mean, if you think about the Arthurian text the Icelandic Arthurian text in conversation with the family sagas, for example,
Right.
that those are texts that are doing something very different,
Yeah.
right, than these Arthurian texts. They're doing very different things, and they are dealing with the you know I think the exasperation and the anger of their history in completely different ways than the Arthurian text. So I think that romance as a genre is doing a few things, and then Arthuriana in particular is doing other things. And so I think that for me, if we're interested in seeing the ways that the Middle Ages resisted these kinds of of um, of materials, we have to look at different genres.
And we have to understand that the complexity of the Middle Ages serves us more than any sense that there was uniformity.
Yeah, yeah.
And that the more we understand about that, the better off we are in understanding the complexity of all of the various discourses now. And
Yeah,
And don't
it
believe
is.
propaganda.
Yeah, it is. We are complex. I mean, that's the exciting part, that we are very different people. And when we learn to accept those differences and make that part of our of the conversation, then and to speak to each other and argue with each other with that acceptance, it's just so much more fun. It's so much more fun to be an academic when you do it that way.
Well, and when you recognize that those different interpretations are necessary for just having a proper dialogue. And and I don't know if you have experienced this in New Mexico, as several people have in other places in the United States, but as a professor, when we talk to our students, and this assumption that somehow we have to be apolitical or somehow we have to not inflect what we teach with wokeness or politics. Do you find that you get any pushback from your students when you do bring it up? Because it's impossible not to. I mean, that would assume that it's like, I'm going to teach history, writing, literature, whatever, and pretend that history doesn't exist or pretend that this is not relevant in some way.
I have not experienced, I think I have experienced, of course, resistance, and I think I see those more sometimes in evaluations. But I've not experienced resistance in the same way I think that some of my colleagues have. One of the things that I do at the beginning of my class that I think helps tremendously is that I frame my classes through ideas of restorative justice and belonging and community. So one of the first things we do is actually talk about how we're going to talk to each other and what that means. And so one of the things I do is listening circles. So instead of having students get in groups and like argue with each other about something, we start with each of them answer the same set of questions so that they all get to answer the same questions. And so they have to listen to each other. And so creating a culture of listening. Um, Someone once said to me, when we scream, it's because we don't think people can hear us, right? And so if we start by teaching students to listen to each other, I think it helps to mitigate that anger. I think the other thing is I'm very open to the students about what I expect from them from the very beginning of class and what we can, the things that we are. For example, I say there is not such a thing as reverse racism. You can't tell, you can't talk to me and say, um, you know,
You're discriminating
people
against
of
me
color
because
in
I'm
general,
white.
yeah,
Yeah.
people of color in general are
Yes.
being discriminated by these other groups. But we can talk about biases, right? And we can talk about things that
Bigotry.
feel unfair and
Yeah.
things that are terrible that happen to us. We can talk about those things and we can talk about our experiences, but we have to understand that when we are talking, you know, when we are trying to be fair about what has happened in the last couple hundred years and the way that institutions work in the United States, then that's very different, right? And so being very clear to students about what this means for them and for us, and so far it has worked. That doesn't mean that it's not gonna work in the future, but so far I think allowing that space for listening has been really positive.
Well, and I want to just say as a kind of a final plug for it, I think The Other Faces of Arthur does a lot of that by understanding the different voices of different authors throughout medieval textual traditions that are, it's important to understand that and to hear it and to listen. And so I want to say thank you so much, NAHIR, for joining us. This has been an absolute delight, and I am going to promote the crap out of your book because it's amazing. But also, I want to thank you again, and I hope that I mean, the first time I met you was at Kalamazoo at the ASIMS dinner for the American Society of Irish Medieval Studies. I hope to see you in another conference setting at another time. And I think the work you do is so important. And so I want to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful, a pleasure.
And I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval, Mischief, and Mayhem.